There are investigations Ghost Adventures has talked about on camera. There are investigations they have refused to talk about at all. And then there is one investigation, recorded at a location in rural Nevada in the early seasons, where the audio from that night was locked away, handed to a private research group, and never cleared for broadcast. That audio has now surfaced. What you are about to hear described is not a highlight from the show. It is not a promotional clip. It is raw, unedited communication between the crew during a night that, according to multiple people who were present, changed the way Zak Bagans approached every single investigation that came after it. Before we get to the audio itself, you need to understand what was happening at this location, why the crew went in the first place, and why what happened that night was serious enough that one of the most experienced paranormal investigators in the world decided the world was not ready to see it. The site was a former mining settlement outside of Winnemucca, Nevada. It had been abandoned in the late 1940s following a series of accidents that were never fully investigated by state authorities. The official record lists 3 deaths between 1944 and 1948, all attributed to mining-related incidents. The families of those workers disputed those findings for decades and never received satisfactory answers. What the official record does not mention is the disappearances. Between 1952 and 1971, 5 individuals were reported missing in the area surrounding the settlement. 3 were hikers passing through the region. 1 was a geologist conducting a survey for a mining company that had expressed interest in reopening the site. 1 was a local man who had lived in Winnemucca his entire life and who had, according to his family, visited the abandoned settlement multiple times without incident before the night he did not come home. None of these individuals were ever found. Law enforcement at the time attributed the cases to the harsh desert terrain surrounding the settlement, the extreme temperature fluctuations common to that part of Nevada, and what one county sheriff's report from 1968 described as the well-documented dangers of disused mining infrastructure. The shafts, the unstable tunnels, the ground that could give way without warning after decades of exposure. These are reasonable explanations. They are also explanations that several of the families refused to accept, not because they believed in the supernatural specifically, but because the investigations into each disappearance had been, in their words, minimal. Cases opened, cases closed. No bodies, no evidence, no answers. The property had sat untouched since the early 1990s when the last private owner, a land speculator who had purchased it with development plans that never materialized, allowed the deed to lapse. It passed into a kind of administrative limbo, not quite public land, not quite private, maintained by no one, visited by almost no one, known primarily to the families of the missing and to a small community of researchers who had been quietly documenting its history for years. One of those researchers was the person who contacted Ghost Adventures. His name has been withheld at his request. He is not a television personality. He is not affiliated with any university or research institution. He is, by his own description, a private individual with a professional background in audio engineering and a decades-long interest in unexplained phenomena, who became obsessed with the Nevada settlement after reading about the disappearances in a regional history book in the early 2000s. He visited the site for the first time in 2004. He returned in 2006. He returned again in 2009. And it was on that third visit that he captured what he later described in a letter to a colleague as the most genuinely unexplainable thing he had ever encountered in over 20 years of independent research. That letter was recovered along with the audio files. It runs to 11 handwritten pages. The relevant passage, which has been transcribed and verified as authentic, reads as follows. He writes that on the night of his third visit, he placed recording equipment at 4 points around the property, as he had done on his 2 previous visits. He writes that the first 3 hours produced nothing of note. He writes that at approximately 11:30 in the evening, while he was reviewing footage in his vehicle at the edge of the property, he heard something that he initially attributed to wind moving through the mine shaft openings. He writes that when he reviewed the recordings the following morning, he realized that whatever he had heard was not wind, and that what the recorders had captured was something he could not explain and had spent the subsequent months attempting to explain through every rational framework available to him. He writes that he contacted Ghost Adventures because he had exhausted his own resources and because he believed the investigation required a crew with more equipment, more experience, and more institutional capacity to follow up on what the recordings suggested. He sent them the recordings along with a summary of the site's history. Zak agreed to investigate. The crew arrived at the settlement on a Thursday evening in late autumn. The exact date has not been publicly confirmed, but based on the production records that have been reviewed by people familiar with the case, it was during the show's 3rd season. The episode was assigned a production number. It was scheduled for broadcast. Post-production work was begun. It was never finished. The crew spent the afternoon doing their standard walkthrough. The site was in severe disrepair. Structures that had once served as housing, storage, and administrative offices for the mining operation were in various stages of collapse. Their wooden frames rotted. Their metal fixtures rusted beyond recognition. Several of the mine shaft openings were still accessible, covered only by deteriorating wooden barriers that offered no real protection. Production safety protocols required that all shaft openings be marked and that no crew member approach within 10 feet of any uncovered shaft without a safety line. These protocols were followed. The crew was briefed. The marks were placed. By the time darkness fell, the equipment was set up and the investigation was ready to begin. The researcher who had recommended the site was not present during the investigation itself. He had offered to attend, but the production team had declined, following their standard practice of keeping outside parties away from active filming to avoid contaminating the footage. This decision would later be the subject of some reflection among those who knew the details of what followed. The first 2 hours of the investigation produced material consistent with what the show typically captures at locations with significant history: temperature anomalies, EMF fluctuations in the main structure, several moments during EVP sessions that the crew flagged for review but which, upon later analysis, were attributed to the natural sounds of the deteriorating buildings settling in the cold night air. Zach later described the early part of the investigation in a private conversation that was documented by someone present as feeling off in a way that was difficult to articulate. He used the word dense. He said the location felt dense. He said it was not like the heaviness he had felt at other locations, the kind of heaviness that he associated with strong residual energy or active intelligent presence. It was something else. He said it felt like being watched by something that was deciding whether or not to engage. That description would prove to be unusually precise. At approximately 10:45 p.m., the crew made a decision that was standard for their investigations. They split up. Zach took the main structure, which had been the administrative building for the mining operation, and which contained the most intact interior spaces on the property. Aaron moved toward the northern end of the property, where the workers' dormitory had stood. The structure itself had largely collapsed, but the foundation and the partial remains of several walls were still standing. And the researcher had noted in his documentation that 3 of the 5 disappearances had last placed the missing individuals in or around that part of the property. Nick stationed himself at a central point between them, maintaining radio contact with both and serving as the hub through which the separate investigations would remain connected. For the next 40 minutes, nothing significant was recorded. Zach conducted a solo EVP session in the administrative building, asking questions of whatever presence might remain, and receiving no audible responses. Aaron walked the perimeter of the dormitory ruins, noting the layout and attempting to connect the physical space with the documented history of the people who had lived and worked there. Nick maintained contact with both of them, relaying information and keeping track of their positions. The secondary ambient recorder that the sound technician had placed on a fence post at the eastern edge of the property was running. It had been running since setup. It would continue to run for the rest of the night. Nobody was paying particular attention to it. At 11:47 p.m., Aaron's radio went silent. Nick attempted contact at 11:48. No response. He attempted again at 11:49. No response. On his third attempt at 11:49 and 30 seconds, he used the emergency call code that the crew reserved for situations where a crew member might be in physical danger. Still nothing. Zach, monitoring the radio communications from inside the administrative building, heard the third call and immediately began moving toward Aaron's last known position. The camera operator assigned to Zach followed. Nick remained at his station but began moving slowly in the direction of the dormitory ruins, maintaining his position as a relay point while also closing the distance in case backup was needed. The crew camera operator assigned to Nick, who had remained stationary throughout the earlier part of the investigation, captured what the production notes would later describe as an audio anomaly at 11:49 and 52 seconds. The camera's onboard microphone recorded it, but because the camera was standard broadcast equipment with standard directional settings, what it captured was partial, degraded, and difficult to isolate. The secondary ambient recorder on the fence post captured it in full. The fence post recorder was approximately 60 meters from Nick's position and approximately 90 meters from the dormitory ruins where Aaron had last been stationed. It was not in a direct line of sight to either of them. It was positioned at the boundary of the property, oriented outward toward the open desert, which is why what it captured that night is so difficult to explain. Whatever produced the sound that the recorder picked up at 11:49 and 52 seconds was not coming from the desert. It was coming from inside the property. The audio file has been analyzed by 3 independent parties. The researcher who originally recovered it submitted it to 2 separate audio forensics laboratories, neither of which was aware of the other's involvement. Both laboratories produced written reports. A third analysis was conducted informally by an audio engineer with experience in broadcast sound who reviewed the file at the researcher's request. All 3 analyses agree on the following. The recording contains a layering of audio signatures beginning at the 11:49 mark that is acoustically inconsistent with the ambient environment as captured in the preceding hours of the recording. In plain language, the sound environment changes in a way that cannot be explained by normal environmental factors, such as wind direction, temperature change, or the movement of wildlife. The first signature is low frequency, below the standard threshold of human hearing but within the capture range of the recorder. This type of infrasound has been documented at other locations associated with reported paranormal phenomena and has been cited in some research as a possible explanation for feelings of unease, dread, and in extreme cases, auditory and visual hallucinations. Its presence on the recording does not, by itself, constitute evidence of anything beyond the natural, as infrasound can be generated by a variety of geological and atmospheric processes. The second signature is what both laboratory reports describe as structured. It follows a pattern. It is not random noise. It has a rhythm that the reports describe as consistent with deliberate acoustic production. In plain language, something was making this sound on purpose. The third signature is the one that none of the 3 analysts has been able to explain. It is a voice, not a fragment, not a stray syllable lifted from background noise and shaped by the tendency of the human brain to find pattern in chaos. Not an audio pareidolia event of the kind that EVP researchers work to guard against and that skeptics correctly identify as the primary source of false positives in paranormal audio research. A complete, clearly structured utterance, a sentence, recorded at a volume and with a clarity that is inconsistent with any member of the crew being within range of that recorder at that moment. The position of every crew member at 11:49 and 52 seconds has been established through a combination of the footage captured by the camera operators and the GPS tracking logs that the production team maintained for safety purposes. Not one of them was within 40 meters of the fence post recorder. The voice on the recording did not belong to any of them. What the voice says has not been released in full. The researcher has been deliberate about this, and the decision is one that the audio forensics laboratories have supported, in part because the content of the utterance raises questions that the researcher believes require careful handling before they are placed into the public domain without context. What has been confirmed, and confirmed independently by all 3 analysts, is the following. The voice says a name. It is not the name of Zach Bagans. It is not the name of Aaron Goodwin. It is not the name of Nick Groff. It is not the name of any member of the production crew who was present at the location that night. It is the name of one of the individuals who was reported missing from that property in 1967. A name that had not been spoken aloud by anyone at the location that night. A name that was not on any materials the crew had brought with them, because the production team had been given a summary of the site's history, but not the detailed case files that would have included the names of the missing individuals. The audio forensics report from the first laboratory states, and this is a direct quotation from the document, that the utterance is unambiguously a human voice producing a proper name in English with no distortion, no degradation, and no acoustic characteristics consistent with electronic manipulation or post-processing alteration. The metadata on the file is intact. The timestamp is continuous. The recording has not been edited. Aaron was found by Zach at 11:53 p.m., 6 minutes after his radio went silent, 6 minutes after the voice on the ambient recorder said a dead man's name into the Nevada desert. He was standing at the edge of one of the open mine shafts. The shaft that he was standing closest to was one of the deepest on the property, documented in the site's historical records as having been sunk to a depth of over 300 feet during the operation's peak years. He was not in distress. He was not injured. He was standing still, looking down. Zach reached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Aaron turned around. According to Zach's account, which he shared with the production team during the debrief session that took place in the crew's vehicles after the investigation was concluded. Aaron's first words were, "Where am I?" Not as a rhetorical question, as a genuine request for information. He did not know where he was standing. He did not know how he had gotten there. The dormitory ruins where he had last been stationed were on the opposite end of the property, a walk of several minutes across uneven, hazardous ground in complete darkness. He had no memory of making that walk. He had no memory of the period between his last clear recollection, which he placed at approximately 11:45, and the moment Zach reached him. 8 minutes. Gone. The gap in Aaron's memory corresponds precisely to the window captured on the ambient recorder. From the moment the sound environment changed, to the moment the voice spoke a name, to the moment Aaron was found standing at the edge of a shaft that dropped 300 feet into the earth. He has no explanation for what happened during those 8 minutes. He has said so publicly on multiple occasions, in terms that leave no ambiguity. He does not know. He has never known. And in the years since that investigation, he has described the experience as the single moment in his career with Ghost Adventures that genuinely frightened him. Not in the way that strange sounds or moving objects frighten a person, but in the deeper way that a loss of control frightens a person. The recognition that something had happened to his mind, or his body, or both, that he could not account for. Whatever was at that property had reached into one of the most experienced paranormal investigators in television and taken 8 minutes from him without leaving a trace. The decision to pull the footage was made in the days following the investigation. It was not made by the network. It was not made by the production company. It was made by Zach Bagans, who communicated his decision to the relevant parties and who has not, in the years since, been pressured to reverse it. The reasons he gave at the time were not fully documented. What is known comes from accounts shared by people who were in those conversations, and those accounts are consistent in their broad outlines, even if they differ in specific details. Zach expressed the view that airing the footage would be irresponsible. He expressed the view that there were things the investigation had captured that he did not fully understand, and that he was not willing to present to an audience without understanding them. He expressed the view that some experiences had to be processed privately before they could be shared publicly, if they could be shared publicly at all. He has spoken about this investigation publicly exactly once. During a question and answer session at a fan event in 2019, an attendee asked him directly whether there was an investigation that had never aired. He confirmed that there was. He confirmed that the reason was not a network decision and not a content restriction. And then he said the following: "Some things you film are meant to stay with the people who were there." He did not elaborate. He has not discussed it since. The researcher who recovered the original recording has been attempting for 8 months to build a framework for understanding what the audio represents. He is careful to say that he does not have one. He is careful to say that the audio, taken alone, does not prove anything. He is careful to say that the question of what produced the voice, what mechanism, what intelligence, what process, is not a question he can answer. What he can say, and what he has said in the documentation he has shared with the laboratories and with the small number of people he has brought into his confidence, is this: the voice was not there before that night. He had recorded at that property 3 times. He had hours of audio from those visits. The voice had never appeared before. Something changed on the night Ghost Adventures came to that location. Something that had been silent for years, or decades, or longer, chose that night to speak. And what it chose to say was the name of a man who had walked onto that property in the summer of 1967 and never walked off. Whether the voice was that man, or something that knew that man, or something that had simply absorbed his name the way a location absorbs the traces of everyone who has ever passed through it, the researcher cannot say. He is honest about the limits of what the recording can tell us. But he says one more thing in his documentation, and it is the thing that has stayed with everyone who has read it. He says that when he first played the recording back, sitting alone in his car in the parking lot of a motel in Winnemucca at 6 in the morning, with the Nevada sun just beginning to come up over the desert, he felt something that he had never felt in over 20 years of research into unexplained phenomena. He felt certain, not certain of what the voice was, not certain of what it meant, certain for the first time in his life that the question of what happens to a person after they disappear, after they walk into a place and never walk out, was not an unanswerable question, that the answer existed, that it was recorded on a file in a folder on his laptop, that it was waiting, and had been waiting for a long time. He says he sat in that parking lot for 2 hours before he felt ready to drive. The audio file remains in the possession of the researcher. He has not released it publicly, and he has said he will not release it until the verification process is complete, and until he has consulted with the families of the individuals whose names appear in the documentation. That consultation is ongoing. 2 of the 5 families have been contacted. 1 has agreed to review the material. 1 has declined and asked that their family member's name not be associated with the research. The Ghost Adventures production team has not publicly acknowledged the investigation or the audio. This is consistent with their general approach to unreleased material, which is to neither confirm nor deny without an active broadcast context. Aaron Goodwin has given no indication that he intends to speak publicly about that night beyond what he has already said in general terms. Zach Bagans has not addressed it since the 2019 fan event comment. The fence post recorder, which captured the only complete version of the audio that night, was the personal equipment of the sound technician who had placed it there as part of the standard setup. It was not production equipment. The files it produced were not technically the property of the production company. The sound technician gave copies to the researcher before the production team was aware of what the recorder had captured. By the time anyone thought to ask about the secondary recording, the technician had left the production. The audio exists. It has been verified. The voice is real. What it means is the question that has now been placed in front of everyone who knows the story, and it is, for the moment, a question without an answer. He built an empire on the paranormal. He turned ghost hunting into a career worth millions. And somewhere along the way, the line between the investigator and the investigated began to blur in ways that even his most devoted fans struggle to explain. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what we're about to cover goes far beyond what any headline has managed to capture about the man, the mythology, and the quietly complicated reality of Zach Bagans at 49 years old. Zach Bagans was born on April 5, 1977, in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Libertyville, Illinois, a small suburban town in Lake County roughly 40 miles north of Chicago. By his own account, he was not a particularly extraordinary child. He was athletic, socially functional, and by most external measures, unremarkable. There was no family tradition of paranormal investigation. There were no early mentors who shaped his worldview around the supernatural. What there was, according to interviews he has given over more than 2 decades, was a single encounter. A single moment that he claims restructured the architecture of his belief system entirely. He was in his early 20s, living in Trenton, Michigan, working a job that had nothing to do with television or production or fame. And he says he saw something that he could not explain. Whether or not you believe that encounter was real, it matters. It matters because it is the origin myth of everything that followed. It is the foundation stone upon which he constructed not just a career, but an identity so total and so consuming that by the time he reached his late 40s, it had become nearly impossible to separate the man from the persona. Ghost Adventures premiered on the Travel Channel on October 17, 2008. But before the series, there was a documentary. Bagans and his longtime collaborator Nick Groff produced a self-shot film in 2004. Shot primarily in the abandoned mining town of Goldfield, Nevada. That documentary, simply titled Ghost Adventures, circulated through film festivals and built enough of a following to attract television interest. It was raw. It was low budget. It had the kind of unpolished urgency that made it feel genuinely dangerous in a way that slicker productions could not manufacture. And that rawness was the thing that Travel Channel wanted to bottle. The series that followed ran for over 20 seasons across nearly 2 decades. It produced more than 200 episodes. It spawned multiple spin-offs, including Ghost Adventures, Screaming Room, Ghost Adventures, Quarantine, and Deadly Possessions. At its commercial peak, Ghost Adventures was one of the highest-rated programs on the Travel Channel, pulling in millions of viewers per episode during its strongest seasons between 2012 and 2016. Bagans became, by any honest accounting, the single most recognizable figure in paranormal entertainment in the United States. That is not a small thing. That is a specific kind of cultural dominance that very few people in any niche ever achieve. And yet, the lifestyle that came with that dominance is where the story becomes complicated. By 2015, Bagans had purchased the Haunted Museum property in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. The building at 307 West Charleston Boulevard had a history. It had served as a private residence, as a law office, and had sat vacant for years before Bagans acquired it. He began converting it into what he described as a permanent installation of cursed, haunted, and paranormally significant objects. The museum opened to the public on October 16th, 2017. It operates today as a ticketed attraction running tours of roughly 45 minutes, with a separate ticketed experience for what Bagans calls the most dangerous room in the building, the space containing the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is an object that Bagans acquired in 2015. It is a wooden wine cabinet alleged to be a vessel for a malevolent Jewish spirit. The previous owner, Kevin Mannis, had sold it on eBay in 2003 with a written account of paranormal activity surrounding it. It passed through multiple hands before Bagans paid a reported amount in the tens of thousands of dollars to acquire it. He documented the acquisition on camera. He said during that filming that he felt immediate physical effects upon contact with the object. He said he became sick. He said his health declined in specific, measurable ways following extended exposure to it. This claim is worth sitting with, because Zak Bagans has made versions of this claim many times across many years, about many objects and many locations. And the pattern of those claims is one of the most revealing things about how his lifestyle has evolved and what it has cost him. In 2009, Bagans investigated the Poveglia Island location off the coast of Venice, Italy. Poveglia is a place with an unambiguous historical record of suffering. It served as a quarantine station during the bubonic plague in the 14th century. It later housed a psychiatric facility that operated until 1968. Hundreds of thousands of people died on that island across several centuries. The physical soil of the island contains measurable concentrations of human ash and bone fragment, the result of mass cremations during the plague years. When Bagans describes Poveglia as one of the most evil places on Earth, he is describing a location that has genuine historical claim to being among the most concentrated sites of human misery in European history. The paranormal interpretation is his. The historical reality is not. He reported feeling possessed during that investigation. He reported that something attached itself to him at Poveglia and did not fully let go. He filmed the aftermath. He showed on camera changes in his demeanor, his voice, his behavior. His colleagues expressed concern. His producers kept cameras rolling. This became one of the most watched episodes of Ghost Adventures and one of the most analyzed pieces of content in the show's long history. This is the lifestyle that Bagans chose and then built a business around. Repeated, voluntary exposure to locations of extreme historical trauma, combined with a personal belief system that those locations retain spiritual energy capable of attaching to and affecting living human beings. Every year, for over 2 decades, that is not a job. That is a vocation with physical consequences. Bagans has spoken openly in interviews across multiple platforms about chronic health issues. He has described persistent headaches, fatigue, mood instability, and what he characterizes as periods of darkness that descend without clear environmental cause. He has referenced these episodes in interviews with outlets including Entertainment Weekly, Rolling Stone, and in his own written works. He has attributed some portion of these experiences to the cumulative effect of years of paranormal investigation. He has, on several occasions, described feeling as though he is carrying something that other people cannot see. Now, that is his interpretation, and his interpretation exists within a belief system that a significant portion of the population does not share. But here is what is undeniable regardless of where you stand on the question of the paranormal. He has spent more than 2 decades in locations characterized by extreme physical conditions, including asbestos contamination, lead paint, compromised structural integrity, black mold, and in multiple international locations, documented biohazards. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, where he has filmed multiple episodes, treated more than 63,000 tuberculosis patients during its operational period from 1910 to 1961. The air quality in that building during filming is not the air quality of a television studio. The abandoned prisons, the decommissioned hospitals, the centuries-old cemeteries in rural locations across the American South and Midwest, where ambient particulate matter from decomposed organic material enters the respiratory system without ceremony or warning. The physical toll of doing this work repeatedly in these specific environments over 20+ years is real regardless of anything supernatural. And Bagans, to his credit, has never pretended otherwise. By 2018, something in his public profile had shifted. He had always been intense, but the interviews from that period, taken in aggregate, showed a man under a different kind of weight. He spoke more frequently about isolation. He spoke about the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships given the demands of the show and the psychological texture of the work. He had ended a relationship with actress Holly Madison in 2016 after approximately 6 months of dating. Before that, there had been other relationships that had not sustained themselves against the pressure of his particular lifestyle. He has never married. As of 2026, he remains unmarried, without children, living in a custom-built compound in Las Vegas that he has described in interviews as being designed specifically to accommodate his unique psychological requirements, including multiple rooms dedicated to the containment and housing of objects from the museum's collection. Think about that for a moment. He lives in a house designed in part as an extension of his work. The objects follow him home. Or rather, he has built a home that makes space for the objects, because the objects are not separate from who he is. They are who he is. In 2020, during the early months of the global pandemic, Bagans filmed Ghost Adventures: Quarantine, which documented the investigation of his own home while the world was in lockdown. He was alone with a small crew. The outside world had effectively shut down, and his response was to turn the cameras inward. He filmed himself in his own space, hunting for evidence of the paranormal in the rooms where he slept, ate, and existed. He described the experience as one of the most disturbing of his career. And given his career, that is a sentence that carries considerable weight. The special aired on the Travel Channel in June of 2020. Viewer response was, by rating standards, strong. Critical response was more divided. Some reviewers noted that the content of the special seemed to reflect a man genuinely grappling with something beyond the theatrical. Others read it as an exceptionally well-produced piece of performance. The truth, as is so often the case, likely contains elements of both. What is not in dispute is that Bagans used one of the most disorienting periods of collective human experience in modern memory as an opportunity to go deeper into the specific psychological territory that defines his life. When the rest of the world was trying to escape, he was trying to find more of the thing that had always pulled him toward the dark. His film work complicates the narrative further. In 2012, Bagans produced and narrated Demon House, a documentary concerning a rental property at 3771 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. The property had been the subject of a widely reported case involving a single mother named Latoya Ammons and her 3 children, who claimed to have experienced severe paranormal and demonic activity beginning in 2011. The case was unusual because it involved documented engagement from the Indiana Department of Child Services, the local police department, and a hospital whose staff members reported witnessing unexplainable events involving the children. These are not anonymous civilian claims. These are institutional records. Bagans purchased the house in 2014 for the reported price of $35,000. He and his crew filmed inside it for months. During that filming, he claims that members of his crew experienced physical and psychological effects, including injury, emotional breakdown, and in at least one documented case, a crew member who left the project abruptly and suffered what Bagans described as a sustained mental health crisis in the aftermath. Bagans himself, by his account, experienced a period of such severe personal disruption during the filming that he considered halting production entirely. The film was released in 2018. Before its wide release, Bagans demolished the house. He demolished a property that he owned, that he had purchased for the purpose of documentary investigation, before the film based on that investigation had reached its primary audience. He said he did it because it was dangerous to leave standing. He said he felt an obligation to prevent others from being drawn to it. The reaction to that decision split along the exact lines you would expect. His believers saw it as an act of moral responsibility. His critics saw it as the destruction of evidence. Both reactions are logical within their respective frameworks. What the demolition accomplished beyond the obvious was to ensure that no subsequent investigator, journalist, or researcher could independently examine the physical space. The story of 3771 Carolina Street became, at that point, entirely dependent on the documentation that Bagans chose to release. That is a pattern worth noting. Across his career, Bagans has operated in an unusual position of simultaneous subject and narrator. He investigates the story. He controls the footage, he edits the footage, he releases the footage on his own terms. And in the case of Demon House, he literally destroyed the primary physical artifact before independent verification was possible. This is not an accusation. It is a description of the structure within which his most significant claims have been made. Now, at 49, the accumulation of these choices is visible on him. If you watch interviews from 2010 and compare them to interviews from 2025, the change is not subtle. The younger Bagans was animated in a way that carried the energy of someone who believed he was on the edge of proving something historic. The older Bagans carries a different weight. He is still articulate. He is still precise. but there is something in him that has settled into a kind of permanent certainty that no longer requires external validation. He does not seem to be trying to convince anyone of anything anymore. He seems, instead, like a man who has long since stopped expecting the world to follow him where he has gone. He has spoken about his diet in interviews, describing an approach to food that prioritizes what he calls clean eating, with restrictions on alcohol and processed foods, that he connects directly to his belief that physical purity affects his capacity to perceive and interact with paranormal energy. He exercises regularly. He has described a sleep schedule that is deliberately structured around his work cycles, which often involve late-night filming sessions that push his body clock into patterns incompatible with conventional social life. He does not keep conventional hours because his work does not permit conventional hours. The lifestyle is total. His relationship with social media has been, by the standards of his industry, unusually controlled. He uses Instagram with consistent frequency, typically posting images related to the museum, new investigations, and personal reflections that maintain the same tonal register as his on-camera persona. He does not perform a separate, lighter version of himself online. The public Zak Bagans and the social media Zak Bagans are the same person. Whether that represents authenticity or an inability to code switch is a question his audience debates with remarkable intensity. The museum has, in recent years, become the most stable axis of his professional life. Ghost Adventures has continued, but the pace of production has slowed from the pace of peak years. The museum operates continuously, independently of filming schedules, and generates revenue from ticketed admissions in a way that does not require Bagans to be physically present or emotionally available on any particular day. It is his legacy project. It is the thing that will exist after the television cameras stop rolling, and it is, arguably, the truest expression of what he actually believes about the world. The museum contains over 30,000 square feet across multiple floors. It houses artifacts including the original diaries from the estate of Jack Kevorkian, whose work on physician-assisted death in the 1980s and 90s generated enormous public and legal controversy. It contains a custom-built car that belonged to Bruno Hauptmann, convicted of kidnapping and murdering the infant son of Charles Lindbergh in 1932. It contains materials connected to Ed Gein, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and multiple other individuals whose names are synonymous with American violent crime history. It houses a significant collection of items connected to reported hauntings from across the United States and internationally. This is not a novelty collection. This is a carefully curated assemblage of objects connected to human suffering, violence, death, and the alleged persistence of negative energy. And Bagans lives in its orbit. He acquires new objects. He studies them. He sometimes films their arrival and their effect on him and his colleagues. He has built a physical monument to the darkest chapters of human experience, and he tends it daily. What does that do to a person over time? Not in the paranormal sense. In the purely psychological, purely neurological, purely human sense, what does decades of sustained focus on death, violence, trauma, and the spaces where those things occurred do to the architecture of someone's inner life? This is not a question that the Ghost Adventures franchise has ever fully sat with, because asking it too honestly would destabilize the entertainment premise. But it is the question that rises to the surface every time Bagans gives an unguarded interview, every time he describes the darkness he carries, every time he explains why he has built a life that keeps the rest of the world at a particular distance. His friendships appear to be few and deeply maintained. Aaron Goodwin, who has been a core member of the Ghost Adventures crew since the early seasons, remains one of his closest associates. The bond between them, documented across hundreds of hours of footage, shows something genuine underneath the theatrical frame. They have argued on camera. They have expressed fear on camera. They have, at various points, expressed what looks very much like real concern for each other in moments that the editing did not fully smooth over. Jay Wasley, who joined the crew as an audio technician in the mid-seasons and became a full investigator, is another sustained presence. Billy Tolley, who has worked with Bagans for over a decade, is another. These men do not simply work for Bagans. They share the specific psychological experience of doing this particular kind of work in these particular conditions, and that shared experience creates a kind of bond that is difficult to replicate in conventional social environments. But this is also part of the isolation. When your closest relationships are with the people who do your exact work, when the shared language of your social life is the language of your professional life, the barriers between self and role begin to dissolve. You stop being a person who does a job and you become a person who is the job. This is not unique to Bagans. It happens to soldiers, to surgeons, to law enforcement professionals who spend careers in violent environments. The difference is that most of those professions have institutional support structures, mandatory psychological evaluation, peer review, and collective professional standards. Ghost hunting, as a discipline, has none of those things. It operates entirely outside institutional frameworks. There is no licensing board. There is no professional oversight. There is no mandatory debriefing after a filming session in an asbestos-heavy building in the middle of the night. This has created a situation in which Zak Bagans, at 49 years old, is a man of genuine accomplishment, genuine influence, and genuine wealth, operating in a psychological landscape with very few guardrails and very few people positioned to offer him anything he has not specifically requested. His net worth has been estimated by multiple financial publications at between $5 and $10 million, with some estimates placing it higher based on the museum's continued growth and the licensing value of the Ghost Adventures catalog. He owns significant real estate in the Las Vegas area. He has production infrastructure. He has a brand that extends across merchandise, digital content, and the museum admission business. By conventional measures of American professional success, he has achieved something substantial. And by conventional measures of personal life, he has arrived at 49 without a partner, without children, with a lifestyle so singular and so consuming that the question of what comes next does not have an obvious answer. He has, in interviews, expressed something close to contentment with this arrangement. He has said that the work requires everything, and that giving everything to the work is what he chooses to do. He has framed the absence of conventional personal milestones not as loss, but as alignment with something he considers more important than those milestones. He believes he is doing necessary work. He believes that the documentation of paranormal phenomena, the preservation of haunted objects, the investigation of locations where dark history accumulated, serves some larger purpose that justifies the personal cost. Whether that belief is a genuine spiritual conviction or a coping mechanism built over decades of unusual choices is the kind of question that cannot be answered from outside. Probably both things are true simultaneously, in the way that most foundational human beliefs contain both sincere conviction and protective function in proportions that shift across time. What the headlines consistently miss about Zak Bagans at 49 is this: the story is not primarily about ghosts. It was never primarily about ghosts. The story is about a man who found a framework for existence in his early 20s, committed to it completely, built a life so thoroughly inside that framework that the framework and the life became indistinguishable, and is now experiencing the particular quality of midlife that comes from that kind of total commitment. Not regret, exactly. Not doubt, exactly. Something more specific and more difficult to name. The settled awareness of someone who has paid the price of their convictions and is living in the world that payment built. His body carries the record of his choices. His face, visible in interviews and social media appearances through 2025 and into 2026, shows the specific kind of aging that comes not from hardship exactly, but from intensity, from years of late nights in cold buildings, from the accumulation of adrenaline responses triggered repeatedly across decades, from the psychological weight of a worldview that places genuine malevolence at the center of the universe and positions the investigator as someone willingly standing at its edge. He has never walked away. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing. He has had every financial opportunity, every cultural opportunity, every practical opportunity to redirect towards something safer and softer. He has not taken any of them. The Haunted Museum is not the choice of a man who is winding down. It is the choice of a man who is going deeper. What is still open, what remains genuinely unanswered, is the question of cost. Not in dollars, in the currency of human experience. The friendships he did not form because the schedule would not allow them. The relationships that ended against the specific gravity of his singular focus. The versions of his life that closed as he walked further into the specific and demanding territory that defines everything he has made and everything he is. Those costs are real even if they are invisible in the footage, and they are the unspoken subject of every interview he has given in the last several years. What has been eliminated as possibility for Bagans is the conventional life. That door closed a long time ago, and he closed it deliberately. The question that is still open is whether the life he built in its place, the museum, the investigations, the mythology, the total identification with a mission that most of the world regards as at best eccentric and at worst delusional, whether that life provides the thing that all human lives require to be sustainable. Not fame, not money, not even purpose, whether it provides enough genuine human connection to carry a person through the years ahead. At 49, Zak Bagans is still working. He is still filming. He is still acquiring objects, still walking into buildings that most people would not enter, still claiming to feel things that most people will never feel. The empire he built is real, and it is sustained by his continued presence at its center. The question is not whether the machine keeps running. The question is what the machine costs the man who is still feeding it. That question does not have an answer today, but it is the right question, and it is the one that the headlines, focused on the ghosts and the gadgets and the ratings numbers, have never quite managed to ask. Before Ghost Adventures existed, before the Travel Channel, before the Haunted Museum, before any of it, there was a young man in a Michigan apartment who saw something in a hallway that he could not explain and could not walk away from. That moment did not launch a career. It launched an obsession, and the distance between that moment and where Zak Bagans stands today, what he has built, what he has lost, what the years of chasing darkness have done to the person underneath the persona, is a story that 26 seasons of television were never designed to tell. What really happened to Zak Bagans goes deeper than any episode he ever filmed. It goes into the parts of his life that the cameras did not follow, the relationships that did not survive, the health that deteriorated in ways he disclosed only partially, the compulsions that tightened their grip the more he fed them, and the specific question that has followed him since that Michigan hallway, and that despite everything he has built in the decades since, he has never been able to fully answer. Stay until the end. This is the complete story. Zachary Alexander Bagans was born on April 3, 1977, in Washington, D.C. His parents divorced when he was young, and his childhood was divided between Glendale, California, and the Detroit metropolitan area of Michigan. Those two geographies shaped him in ways that are visible if you know where to look. The California years gave him an exposure to entertainment culture, to the specific texture of a place where image and ambition are the ambient atmosphere, where people construct versions of themselves for public consumption as a matter of routine. The Michigan years gave him something different. The industrial decay of the Detroit region in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the abandoned factories and shuttered neighborhoods, the specific quality of a landscape in the process of becoming a ruin, left an imprint on his aesthetic sensibility that no production designer could have manufactured. Zak Bagans grew up around places that had been left behind, buildings that held the residue of everything that had happened in them, and then been emptied of the people who made it happen. That relationship to abandoned space was not something he acquired as a television host. It was something the geography of his childhood built into him before he had a name for what it meant. He was not a particularly social child in the conventional sense. People who knew him before he became a public figure described someone who existed at an angle to the ordinary social world, who was drawn more to the margins of experience than to its center, who was curious about things that most of his peers found uncomfortable to think about. Death, what persists after it, whether the places where significant things happen retain something of what happened in them. These were not casual interests. They were consuming ones, and they consumed him quietly, privately, across the years of an ordinary Midwestern adolescence, until the night in 2002 when they stopped being theoretical. He was 25 years old and living in Trenton, Michigan, working as a wedding DJ, building a life that had nothing on its surface to indicate what was coming. The apartment was ordinary. The hallway was ordinary. And then it was not. The apparition he encountered that night, a female figure that he has described in multiple accounts as fully formed, visible, and entirely outside any framework his existing understanding of the world could accommodate, did not frighten him into retreat. It pulled him forward. He has said, in interviews across the years, that what the encounter produced in him was not fear as a terminal state, but fear as a beginning, a door that opened onto a question he could not close again. Who was she? What was she? What did it mean that she was there? And what else was out there in the dark that he had been living alongside without knowing it? Within months, he had acquired his first camera. Within a year, he had begun researching locations associated with documented paranormal activity. Within 2 years, he was in Goldfield, Nevada, in the abandoned Goldfield Hotel, filming the raw and unscripted documentary footage that would become the foundation of everything that followed. The decision to go to Goldfield was not a career calculation. There was no career to calculate around. It was the decision of a person who needed to know something and had identified the most direct available route to finding out. What that decision cost him in terms of the life he did not build while he was building Ghost Adventures instead is a question his public narrative rarely frames directly, but that the timeline of his personal life answers clearly enough for anyone paying attention. Ghost Adventures premiered on October 17, 2008, And the version of Zak Bagans that the audience met in those early seasons was a person operating at the absolute peak of a specific kind of fearless energy. He was 31 years old. He had nothing to protect because he had not yet built anything worth protecting. He walked into Bobby Mackey's music world and provoked whatever was in there with a directness that the show's producers initially found alarming. He sat alone in the basement of Eastern State Penitentiary after the rest of the crew had left because he was not finished yet. He went to Poveglia Island, a location whose history of plague death and psychiatric institutionalization made it one of the most psychologically extreme environments that European paranormal investigation had to offer. And he did not leave when everything in his body told him to. That fearlessness was not performance. It was the authentic output of a person for whom the question being investigated mattered more than the personal cost of investigating it. What the audience was not watching during those years was what the production schedule was doing to the rest of his life. Ghost Adventures at its peak was not a show that filmed occasionally. It was a production whose location requirements, travel demands, and overnight lockdown format created a professional life that was structurally incompatible with the ordinary rhythms of personal relationship and domestic stability. Zak Bagans has never married. The relationships that developed and ended across the years of the show's production have been addressed in his public presence only obliquely, in the way that a person addresses things they have processed but not fully resolved. The specific texture of building a professional identity so completely around an obsession that the obsession and the identity become indistinguishable, so that the question of who you are when the cameras are not rolling becomes genuinely difficult to answer, is something the episode count of Ghost Adventures documents without ever naming directly. He gave the show everything, and the show took it. By the middle seasons of Ghost Adventures, people who worked closely with Zak Bagans were noticing something that the show's cameras were not positioned to document: the physical toll of years of overnight location shooting, of sustained sleep disruption, of repeated exposure to environments whose air quality and structural conditions created genuine occupational health considerations, was becoming visible in ways that production makeup and editing could partially but not entirely address. He has spoken publicly about health issues across the years, always in terms that acknowledged their existence without fully mapping their scope. Chronic fatigue, whose specific character differed from ordinary tiredness in ways that people who have experienced it describe as qualitatively different from anything that rest alone resolves. Physical symptoms whose connection to specific locations he has discussed in the framework of paranormal attachment, a framework that his medical advisors presumably engaged with differently than his paranormal research community did. The gap between those two frameworks, between the investigator's explanation and the physician's explanation, is one that Zak Bagans has lived inside for long enough that the distinction may have become less important to him than the fact of the symptoms themselves. The Demon House investigation represents the most publicly documented instance of what extended paranormal exposure produced in him physically and psychologically. The Gary, Indiana property he purchased in 2014 after a family reported experiencing what they described as a demonic infestation severe enough to warrant state child protective services. Involvement was not a location Bagans investigated briefly. He lived there. He filmed there across an extended period. And what happened to him during that time, the physical deterioration, the behavioral changes that people on the production documented, and that he subsequently addressed in the film he made about the experience, was significant enough that he had the building demolished after filming was complete. Not sold, demolished. A person who demolishes a property rather than sell it or walk away from it is communicating something about what happened there that the language of a standard episode of Ghost Adventures was not equipped to carry. The story of what happened at the Demon House in Gary, Indiana, is the most important chapter in understanding what Ghost Adventures ultimately did to Zak Bagans, because it is the chapter where the framework of television investigation gave way entirely to something that operated by different rules. The Ammons family, Latoya Ammons, her mother Rosa Campbell, and her 3 children had reported experiences in the property on Carolina Street that included children walking backward up walls, family members speaking in voices that were not their own, and a series of events documented by social workers and medical professionals that the official state record treated with a seriousness that official records in this area almost never produce. When that story reached Bagans, he did not pitch it to a network and wait for a production green light. He purchased the house with his own money before a single camera arrangement was in place. That decision tells you more about where he was psychologically at that point in his career than any interview he has given about it. What the filming period at the Demon House produced in him has been described differently by different people who were present. The documentary he released in 2019 shows a version of those events. What people who were on the production have said about what the documentary does not show suggests that version is partial. What is documented in the film itself is a progressive deterioration across the filming period, in his physical presentation, in his behavioral patterns, in the specific quality of his engagement with the property and with the people around him. That is visible enough on screen that viewers who watch it carefully have consistently described it as one of the more genuinely disturbing documents the paranormal genre has produced, not because of what the house contained, because of what it appeared to do to the person investigating it. He had the building torn down in 2016. He kept the staircase. It is in the museum now, and whatever he believes came with it is something he has chosen to keep in his proximity rather than put at a distance. That choice is the chapter of the Demon House story that the demolition did not resolve. The Zak Bagans Haunted Museum opened in Las Vegas in October of 2017, occupying a 1920s mansion on Charleston Boulevard that had its own documented history before Bagans acquired it. The collection he installed inside it was not assembled for the museum. It was assembled across years of personal acquisition that preceded the museum's existence, and that the museum ultimately provided a permanent home for. The Dybbuk box, whose history of reputed demonic attachment Bagans had documented in a previous investigation, Charles Manson's television set, Jack Kevorkian's van, Ed Gein's cauldron, Michael Jackson's mirror, acquired from Neverland Ranch, the possessed staircase from the Demon House in Gary, objects whose connection to violence, death, mental illness, and documented suffering was not incidental to their acquisition, but central to it. What the museum communicates about Zak Bagans that no interview has said directly is that the accumulation is not curatorial. A curator acquires objects for their historical or cultural significance and maintains a professional relationship to them. What Bagans has built is something closer to a private cosmology, a physical manifestation of a belief system organized around the idea that suffering leaves traces in objects, and that those traces are real and meaningful and worth being near. He lives with this collection. He works in its proximity. He continues to add to it. After everything that 26 seasons of Ghost Adventures produced in him, the health consequences, the personal costs, the specific deterioration that the Demon House filming documented, the response was not withdrawal from the things he believes carry darkness. It was deeper immersion. The museum is the most honest self-portrait Zak Bagans has ever produced. And what it portrays is a person for whom the question that opened in that Michigan hallway in 2002 has not closed. It has expanded. It has become the organizing principle of everything. And the cost of that expansion is visible in the collection itself, in the objects chosen, in the building maintained, in the person who cannot stop adding to it. The version of Zak Bagans that the public has access to is a carefully maintained construction, not dishonest. The fear on camera is real, the obsession is real, the genuine investigative commitment is real, but selective in the way that all public personas are selective. The things that do not appear in that construction are the things that the people closest to him across the years of Ghost Adventures have been most careful about in what they say publicly. The specific texture of his private life during the production years, the relationships that the show's demands made impossible to sustain, the degree to which the line between the investigator and the investigation had, by the later seasons, become difficult to locate from either side, the health issues whose full dimension his public statements have consistently understated, and the specific quality of his engagement with the material he works with, the haunted objects, the cursed locations, the documented suffering he has spent his adult life putting himself in proximity to, that the people who have watched it up close describe in terms that are more concerned than celebratory. He has spoken in interviews about loneliness, not dramatically, not in a way designed to generate sympathy, but in the matter-of-fact way that a person speaks about a condition they have accommodated rather than resolved. The life that Ghost Adventures required of him was not a life that made the ordinary architecture of sustained human relationship easy to build or maintain. He was gone constantly. He was in extreme environments constantly. He was operating in a professional context that made specific and unusual demands on his psychological and physical resources constantly. And the person you become across years of that existence is a person who has been shaped by it in ways that the ordinary social world does not always know what to do with. That is the version of Zak Bagans that the show never had room for. The one that exists when the cameras are not running and the lockdown is over and the building is empty and the question is still there. The same way it was in the Michigan hallway in 2002, waiting for an answer that has not come yet. There is a version of Ghost Adventures that longtime viewers identified without being able to fully articulate what they were seeing. The show that existed in seasons 1 through 5 had a specific quality of genuine uncertainty, of a team that did not know what they were going to find and was visibly affected by what they found. The show that existed in seasons 15 through 20 had a different quality, more polished, more confident in its own mythology, more settled into the narrative frameworks that the audience had come to expect. And something in that settling was lost, not fabricated. The locations were still real. The evidence was still documented. The cast was still the same people, but the specific quality of not knowing, of being genuinely at the edge of understanding in real time, had been replaced by something more managed, more produced, more aware of what a Ghost Adventures episode was supposed to look and feel like. What that change reflected about Zak Bagans is the most complicated dimension of his story, because the shift was not cynical. It was not the result of a deliberate decision to trade authenticity for production value. It was the natural consequence of what years of sustained investigation produces in a person, a familiarity with the extreme that gradually changes the relationship to it. The locations that would have undone him in Season 2 were locations he could walk through in Season 18 with a professional composure that the early seasons did not have. That composure is not indifference. It is something harder to name. The accumulation of exposure that changes not what you believe, but how you experience what you believe. And it made the later seasons of Ghost Adventures something that the people who loved the early seasons recognized as the same show, while understanding, without being able to say exactly why, that it was not quite the same man making it. Zak Bagans is in his late 40s now. The Haunted Museum is open and operating and continues to be one of the more unusual cultural institutions in Las Vegas, which is not a city that lacks for unusual cultural institutions. He continues to investigate, to produce, to engage with the paranormal research community that Ghost Adventures helped build into the mainstream phenomenon it has become. He continues to acquire objects for the collection. He continues to put himself in proximity to the things he believes carry darkness, to the locations where documented suffering has left whatever it leaves, to the question that has organized his entire adult life around itself without providing the answer that would allow him to stop. That is the heartbreaking part, not the health, not the loneliness, not the relationships that the production years made impossible. Those are the costs, and they are real, and they matter. But the truly heartbreaking dimension of what happened to Zak Bagans is that after everything, after 26 seasons, after the Demon House, after the museum, after the decades of lockdowns in the darkest buildings on Earth, the question is still open. He has not found what he is looking for. He has found extraordinary things. He has documented experiences that the scientific community cannot explain and that millions of viewers cannot dismiss. He has built the most significant paranormal investigation franchise in television history out of a single unanswered question encountered in a Michigan hallway at 25 years old. And the question is still there, waiting, the same way it always was. That is what happened to Zak Bagans, and it is the most human story that Ghost Adventures ever contained, hidden in plain sight across every season, visible in every investigation, audible in every moment when the building goes quiet and he is standing alone in the dark and asking one more time if anyone is there. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe now and turn your notifications on. There is more coming. There is a dimension of Zak Bagans that his Ghost Adventures audience knows existed but has never fully engaged with. The creative ambitions that ran parallel to the investigation work, and that reveal a person whose relationship to his own public image was more complicated and more self-aware than the lockdown format of the show generally allowed to surface. He directed, he wrote, he produced projects that existed outside the Ghost Adventures framework and that reflected a genuine interest in storytelling as a craft, rather than simply as a vehicle for paranormal content delivery. The Demon House documentary was the most significant of these, and its reception, critical acknowledgement of its genuine unsettling quality sitting alongside skeptical readings of its factual claims, placed him in the specific uncomfortable position of a person whose creative work is taken more seriously than his investigative work by the institutions whose validation he was not primarily seeking. He did not make Demon House for critics. He made it because something happened in that building that he needed to document in a form that a standard Ghost Adventures episode could not contain. His book, Dark World, published in 2010 during the show's early peak, offered a version of his personal history and investigative philosophy that his audience received as confirmation of what they already believed about him and that the broader reading public largely did not encounter. He has worked on music. He has maintained creative interests that exist at a significant distance from the paranormal investigation brand that his name is commercially attached to. And those interests, the evidence of a person whose interior life is broader and more varied than the Ghost Adventures persona communicates, are the clearest available indication that the cost of building that persona across 2 decades is not simply the cost of the investigations themselves. It is the cost of becoming, in the public imagination, a single thing, when the person inside the persona has always been something more complicated and less easily categorized than that single thing allows. The gap between the public Zak Bagans and the private one is not a gap between performance and reality. The performance is part of the reality. The obsession is genuine. The investigation is genuine. The fear and the commitment and the specific quality of a person, organized entirely around a question they cannot stop asking, are all genuine, but they are not the whole of him. And the years of Ghost Adventures, by making them the entirety of his public identity, created a situation in which the rest of him, the creative ambitions, the private losses, the loneliness he has mentioned without dwelling on, the health that the work has affected in ways he has not fully disclosed, exists in a shadow cast by the very thing he built. That shadow is where the heartbreaking part lives, and it is where Zak Bagans has been living, alongside everything else, for a very long time. Zak Bagans has been the face of Ghost Adventures for 20 seasons. The franchise he built from a consumer camera and an overnight lockdown at the Goldfield Hotel into the most recognized paranormal investigation brand in television history. He has never walked away from it, until now. What happened behind the scenes that produced the decision nobody in the Ghost Adventures audience was prepared for is what this video documents completely. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the full story changes everything. Zak Bagans did not stumble into Ghost Adventures, he built it. The origin story is documented well enough that the Ghost Adventures audience knows its outline. The consumer camera, the overnight lockdown at the Goldfield Hotel in Goldfield, Nevada, the independent documentary whose footage convinced a network that what Bagans was doing in front of a camera in haunted locations was different enough from everything else the paranormal television genre was producing to justify a broadcast deal. What is less well documented, what the 20 seasons of broadcast content that followed the original documentary have never fully represented, is what sustaining Ghost Adventures across 20 seasons at the level of personal investment and personal exposure that the show's authenticity has always required has cost the man at the center of it. Ghost Adventures works because Zak Bagans is genuinely invested in what the show documents, not invested in the entertainment format, invested in the paranormal question itself, in the specific and personal way that a man whose first significant paranormal experience produced a response that organized the subsequent decades of his professional life around understanding it is invested. He has discussed this origin investment across multiple public communications in terms that communicate something specific about the character of the commitment the show represents. Not a career choice, but a vocation. The specific kind of sustained personal calling that produces the quality of genuine engagement the audience recognizes in his on-camera presence, and that distinguishes Ghost Adventures from the paranormal television format's more manufactured alternatives. Sustaining a vocation across 20 seasons of cable television production, with everything that sustained commercial production requires from the person whose genuine personal investment is the product's most essential commercial asset, produces a specific and cumulative toll whose character the broadcast format has never been designed to fully represent. The physical toll of sustained direct exposure to extreme locations under production conditions that prioritize dramatic content alongside investigative rigor. The psychological toll of 20 years of genuine engagement with phenomenon whose implications for the nature of reality, his scientific collaborators, and his own experience have been building toward conclusions that his public communications have been carefully managing. The professional toll of maintaining the creative and investigative integrity of a franchise whose commercial scale has created institutional pressures whose direction is not always aligned with the investigation's genuine demands. All of it has been accumulating across 20 seasons. And what happened behind the scenes that produced the decision this video's title describes is the specific development whose character made continued accumulation something Bagans assessed as no longer sustainable in the form Ghost Adventures has always required from him. The Ghost Adventures franchise at 20 seasons is an institutional entity whose scale and whose commercial infrastructure bear almost no resemblance to the independent documentary that produced it. The Travel Channel broadcast relationship, the Haunted Museum in Las Vegas whose permanent existence as a physical physical institution whose curation Baggins has personally overseen gives the franchise a presence outside the broadcast format that no comparable paranormal television production has established. The Demon House documentary, whose specific production circumstances and whose specific personal consequences Baggins has discussed more candidly than any other single investigation in his public record. The books, the merchandise, the production company infrastructure whose operation the franchise's commercial scale has required, the social media presence whose sustained maintenance is its own specific and ongoing demand on the attention and the creative energy of the person at its center. Building all of that across 20 seasons while simultaneously maintaining the genuine investigative engagement that the show's authenticity requires, while continuing to personally enter locations whose extreme character the franchise's reputation for going further than any comparable production has established as the baseline expectation, is not the sustainable professional proposition that the commercial success it has produced might suggest from the outside. The people who have worked closest to Baggins across the franchise's production history have described in various partial accounts the specific quality of sustained professional and personal demand that operating at the center of an institution of this scale, while maintaining the personal investment whose authenticity is the institution's most essential asset, produces. It is not the ordinary demand of a successful television career. It is the specific demand of being simultaneously the creative force, the investigative presence, the public face, the brand identity, and the genuine personal heart of something that 20 seasons of commercial development have made far larger than any of those individual roles can be sustained within by a single person operating at the level of genuine investment the show has always required. What happened behind the scenes that made that specific combination of demands unsustainable is the specific development this video documents, and understanding it requires understanding what the 20 seasons of building it produced, not just commercially but personally. The Zak Baggins Haunted Museum in Las Vegas is the most direct physical expression of the Ghost Adventures franchise's relationship to the paranormal question that Baggins has ever created. It is not a merchandise store or a tourist attraction organized around the show's brand. It is a collection. Baggins's personal, curatorial, sustained engagement with the physical objects whose anomalous histories and whose documented effects on the people who encounter them he has been accumulating and studying across the span of his investigation career. The Dybbuk box, the Bela Lugosi mirror, the Charles Manson items, the specific objects whose provenance and whose documented behavioral history place them in the category of dangerous in a specific and non-metaphorical sense that Baggins has discussed in the careful terms of someone whose direct experience with the objects has given him a framework for that characterization that his public communications manage carefully. The museum is not simply a collection of spooky things organized for visitor entertainment. It is the physical archive of Baggins's investigation career, the accumulated material evidence of 20 years of direct engagement with the most extreme documented paranormal objects that his investigation history has produced, or that his curation has identified as warranting inclusion. Maintaining that archive, being the person whose physical proximity to its contents is the most sustained of anyone connected to the institution, whose curatorial decisions about what enters it and how it is managed reflect a genuine and personal assessment of the specific risks those decisions involve, is a sustained exposure whose specific character the people who have been closest to Baggins across the museum's operational history have described in terms that communicate something about the cumulative toll of that exposure that the institution's public presentation as a visitor attraction does not fully convey. The Demon House is the clearest documented precedent for what sustained proximity to the category of phenomenon the museum's collection represents produces in Baggins personally. He purchased it, he filmed in it, he demolished it before any other investigator could access it, and he has discussed what the production of the Demon House documentary did to him physically and personally in more specific and more candid terms than he has applied to any other single investigation in his public record. The museum contains dozens of objects whose individual histories place them in the same category as the Demon House. The cumulative effect of sustained proximity to that collection, whatever the specific character of that cumulative effect is in the terms that Baggins's direct experience of it has established, is part of the behind-the-scenes story whose development this video documents. The Ghost Adventures broadcast record across 20 seasons is an extraordinarily extensive public documentation of Zak Baggins's investigation career, hundreds of lockdown sessions, dozens of locations across multiple countries, a body of documented evidence whose breadth and whose cumulative character represent the most extensive paranormal investigation archive that any single presenter has produced in the history of the television format. What the broadcast record does not document, what the production framework that shapes raw investigation footage into broadcast episodes was not designed to represent, is the behind-the-scenes reality of what sustaining that investigation across 20 seasons has required of the people who make it and of Bagans specifically. The gap between the investigation and the broadcast version of the investigation is not simply an editing gap. It is a gap between what the investigation actually produces and what the commercial framework within which it is presented can accommodate showing. The evidence management decisions that the network's editorial process has applied to the most significant findings across the franchise's run, the personal consequences that sustained direct exposure to the extreme locations the franchise's reputation has established as its investigative domain produces in the people experiencing them that the broadcast format's adventure presentation has consistently framed as dramatic rather than genuinely costly. The specific professional tensions that maintaining the creative integrity of a genuine investigation within the commercial structure of a major network franchise generates across 20 seasons of sustained production. The crew members whose experiences during the most extreme investigation sessions the show has conducted have produced documented personal consequences that the broadcast episodes have referenced without fully characterizing. The specific quality of what Aaron Goodwin and Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley, the crew members whose sustained presence in the franchise's investigation sessions gives them the most direct experience of what those sessions produce beyond what the cameras capture, have communicated in the limited accounts available outside the broadcast record about what 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures has produced in them, and what Bagans himself has been carrying across the franchise's full run that the broadcast format's management of his public presentation has been containing, and that the development this video documents has apparently finally moved beyond the point where continued containment is something he is able to maintain. The specific development behind the scenes that produced Zak Bagans' decision to step away from Ghost Adventures is the element of this video whose direct characterization is simultaneously the most significant and the most carefully constructed, because the complete account of what happened involves a convergence of factors whose individual significance the prior parts of this video have been establishing and whose combined weight produced in Bagans a specific assessment about the sustainability of continuing the franchise in the form it has always required from him. The convergence includes the cumulative personal cost dimension, whose character the prior parts of this video have established, the sustained physical and psychological toll of 20 seasons of direct investigative exposure at the level of genuine personal investment that the show's authenticity demands, the specific impact of the Haunted Museum's sustained proximity demands on a person whose direct experience with the objects it contains gives him the most specific available understanding of what that proximity involves, and the accumulated weight of what the complete investigation record contains that the broadcast format has been managing rather than fully communicating. It includes a specific investigation development from the most recent production period whose character placed it in a category that the prior season's most extreme findings had not. Not more of the same, more extreme, more documented, more significant in the specific technical terms of what the investigation's instrument data and its direct experiential component established about what the investigation had encountered, something qualitatively different from the prior record's most extreme moments in a way that the people closest to the production during the relevant period have described in consistent terms as producing in Bagans a response whose character they had not previously observed across 20 seasons of watching him process what the investigation generates. The institutional dimension is the third component, the travel channel relationship, the franchise's commercial scale, the specific tension between what the investigation's most recent findings demanded in terms of honest public communication and what the institutional framework within which the investigation operates was willing to accommodate. The convergence of all three, the cumulative personal cost, the qualitatively different recent finding, and the institutional tension, is what produced the decision, what the decision specifically involves, what quitting Ghost Adventures in the specific form this video's title describes actually means for the franchise and for what comes next, is what the following sections establish. Zak Bagans stepping away from Ghost Adventures is not a retirement, and it is not a simple production hiatus of the kind that television schedules regularly require. It is something whose specific character is more significant than either of those conventional frameworks for understanding a presenter's departure from a long-running franchise fully captures, and whose specific implications for the Ghost Adventures brand for the Travel Channel relationship, and for the paranormal investigation community that has built its understanding of what the franchise represents around Baggins's specific and sustained presence at its center, are what this section of the video addresses directly. The decision, as it has been communicated in the accounts available from people connected to the production, is a decision about form rather than about the investigation itself. Baggins's commitment to the paranormal question, to the investigation whose sustained pursuit has organized his professional and personal life since the Goldfield Hotel experience that produced the original documentary, is not what the decision addresses. The investigation continues. The haunted museum continues. The specific engagement with what the investigation has been finding and what it means continues. What the decision addresses is the specific form that engagement has taken across 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures as a Travel Channel broadcast franchise. The specific requirements that the commercial production relationship and the broadcast format impose on his personal investment in the investigation and on the public communication of what the investigation produces. He is stepping away from the form, not from the work. The distinction is significant because it establishes what comes next as something other than a retirement from the paranormal investigation field, and because it communicates something specific about where the decision comes from that a straightforward retirement or a simple production burnout would not. A man who steps away from the form of his investigation while maintaining the investigation itself is a man whose assessment of the situation is that the form has become an obstacle to the investigation rather than a vehicle for it. That assessment and the specific character of what made the commercial broadcast format feel like an obstacle rather than a vehicle in the period that produced the decision is what the next section of this video addresses. The specific reason that the Ghost Adventures broadcast format has become an obstacle to the investigation rather than a vehicle for it, in the terms that the decision this video documents communicates about Baggins's current assessment of the relationship between the two, is connected to what the investigation's most recent findings have been establishing about the nature of what the show has been documenting. The Ghost Adventures broadcast record is built around a specific and sustained commercial premise: the ongoing dramatic investigation of locations whose paranormal histories and whose documented outputs provide the content whose delivery the network's audience relationship depends on. That premise requires the investigation to be understood as an ongoing approach to answers rather than as the documentation of findings whose character the answers dimension of the premise cannot accommodate. What the investigation has been finding in the most recent production period, and what the qualitatively different development this video's prior sections have referenced without fully characterizing, is evidence whose character places it in the answer rather than the approach category. Not more compelling approach evidence. Evidence whose implications, if communicated publicly in the specific and direct terms that Baggins's 20 years of investigative experience give him the framework to characterize accurately, would require the broadcast format to do something the commercial premise cannot accommodate. Acknowledge that the investigation has arrived somewhere. The prior season's most extreme findings were manageable within the format because their character, however dramatic and however evidentially significant, could be framed as compelling approach evidence, as the most significant steps yet toward an answer that the investigation was still working toward. What the most recent findings have produced in Baggins's assessment of the investigation's current position is something that the approach framing no longer fits, and communicating that assessment publicly within the broadcast framework whose commercial premise depends on the approach framing is the specific tension whose irresolvability produced the decision this video documents. The Ghost Adventures audience that has built its relationship to the franchise across 20 seasons of watching Zak Bagans conduct the most extensive, sustained paranormal investigation in television history deserves an honest account of what his decision to step away from the broadcast format means for the investigation's future and for their relationship to the complete record the investigation has produced. The broadcast record they have followed across 20 seasons is the portion of the complete Ghost Adventures investigation record that the Travel Channel relationship's editorial framework has permitted to reach them, not the complete record. Baggins has communicated this in terms that have become progressively more direct across the franchise's most recent seasons. The language about what the cameras captured and what the network's editorial process has done with the most significant elements of the complete record has been building toward the specific, kind of honest public accounting that the broadcast format's commercial constraints have always prevented him from fully delivering. The decision to step away from the broadcast format is connected to that building, to the progressive narrowing of the distance between what the investigation has found and what Baggins has determined the audience deserves to know about what it has found. Stepping away from the commercial format whose constraints have been the specific mechanism preventing the complete, honest communication of the investigation's findings is not the end of that communication. It is potentially the removal of the primary institutional obstacle to its delivery. What comes next? What Bogak builds outside the Travel Channel broadcast relationship with the investigation's complete record and with the specific recent findings whose character the broadcast format could not accommodate, is the chapter of the Ghost Adventures story whose development the audience that has followed 20 seasons of the broadcast version has been investing in across the entirety of those 20 seasons without knowing that this is where the investment was building toward. The format that contained the investigation is ending. The investigation is not. Zak Bagans built Ghost Adventures from a consumer camera and a genuine question into the most recognized paranormal investigation franchise in the history of television. 20 seasons, hundreds of investigations, a body of documented evidence whose breadth the paranormal television genre has never matched, and whose complete contents, including the significant portions whose broadcast suppression the franchise's most recent public communications have been approaching an honest account of, represent the most extensive private paranormal investigation archive that any individual has ever assembled. The decision to step away from the broadcast format that has been the vehicle for the investigation's public documentation is not the conclusion of what the 20 seasons were building toward. It is the conclusion of the specific institutional arrangement whose commercial requirements have been the primary obstacle to the complete, honest public communication of what the investigation has found. What that decision changes about everything the Ghost Adventures broadcast record represents is the context within which the record's most significant gaps, the evidence management decisions, the editorial suppressions, the distance between what the investigation produced and what the audience was shown, need to be understood. They were not simply the ordinary content management decisions of a commercial television production. They were the specific mechanism by which the gap between what the Ghost Adventures investigation found and what the institutional framework around it could accommodate showing was maintained across 20 seasons of production. Bagans stepping away from that institutional framework is the first step toward the closure of that gap. What the complete account of what Ghost Adventures found, delivered outside the commercial constraints that have been managing it, looks like is the question that the decision opens. The investigation found things. The format contained what the finding communicated. The format is ending. The finding is not. 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures were building toward this moment. The moment when the man who built the investigation decided that the institutional vehicle whose commercial requirements had always placed limits on the honest communication of the investigation's findings was a vehicle he was no longer willing to accept the limits of. What comes next is what those 20 seasons were always pointing toward, and what it contains is what the broadcast record's most attentive audience has been sensing across the investigation's full run without having it confirmed. The confirmation is coming. The format that delayed it is ending, and Zak Bagans, at whatever personal cost the decision represents, has decided that the investigation deserves the honest account the broadcast format was never equipped to provide. Ghost Adventures has produced controversial moments across 20 seasons, locations that divided the audience, evidence that divided the scientific community, editorial decisions that divided the fan base. But one episode stands apart from all of it. The episode that produced more internal conflict, more external pressure, and more sustained silence from everyone connected to its production than anything the franchise has ever broadcast. Zak Bagans just exposed the truth behind it. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Ghost Adventures has never been a show that avoided controversy. The franchise built its audience on the willingness to go further than other paranormal productions, to document evidence that other shows would have softened, to present conclusions that other presenters would have hedged, and to put Zak Bagans personally in the frame of whatever the investigation produced rather than maintaining the professional distance that the paranormal television format typically preserves between the presenter and the phenomenon. That willingness generated controversy consistently, and the show absorbed it consistently. The critical dismissals, the skeptical community's systematic challenges to specific pieces of evidence, the occasional friction with location owners and community members who felt the production had not represented their spaces fairly. All of it was processed within the franchise's operational culture as the ordinary cost of doing what the show did the way the show did it. The controversy surrounding the episode Bagans just exposed the truth behind is different from that ordinary operational controversy in a specific and documentable way. It is different not because the episode's content was more extreme than what the franchise had previously broadcast. The catalog of Ghost Adventures episodes contains content that exceeds the controversial episode in its dramatic extremity without generating comparable sustained sensitivity within the production. It is different because the controversy surrounding this episode has never been fully external. It has lived inside the production, in the relationship between the investigation team and the network, in the specific decisions that were made about how the episode was assembled and what it contained when it was broadcast, and in the gap between what the investigation produced and what the audience was permitted to see. Every other Ghost Adventures controversy has been about whether what the show broadcast was real or significant or responsibly presented. The controversy surrounding this episode has always been about whether what the show broadcast was complete, whether the version of the investigation the audience received was the investigation that actually occurred. Bagans has been carrying the answer to that question for years. What he just exposed is that answer, and the answer changes everything about what the most controversial Ghost Adventures episode actually was and what it actually documented. The episode at the center of Bagans' exposure is one that the Ghost Adventures audience will recognize immediately, not because it was the most dramatically extreme episode in the franchise's broadcast history, but because its reception, from the moment it aired, was marked by a specific quality of unresolved tension that the show's audience has never fully been able to account for. The broadcast version of the episode follows the standard Ghost Adventures format: location establishment, historical research, the lockdown session, the evidence review. What distinguishes it from the standard format episodes that surround it in the broadcast record is a quality that the most attentive viewers of the franchise noticed immediately and have been noting in community discussions ever since. The episode feels edited in a way that the show's other episodes do not edited in the normal sense of footage being shaped into a coherent narrative. All television production involves that kind of editing, and Ghost Adventures has always been transparent about the production process that shapes its raw investigation footage into broadcast episodes. Edited in a different sense, edited in the sense of something being missing, of the narrative moving between moments in ways that suggest the connecting tissue between those moments has been removed rather than compressed, of evidence being referenced in ways that imply more extensive documentation exists than what the broadcast version presents, and of the investigation team's behavior in specific segments of the episode communicating a context that the footage surrounding those segments does not supply. The audience noticed. The Ghost Adventures fan community's response to the episode in the period following its broadcast was distinctive in the specific nature of the questions it generated, not the standard debates about whether the evidence was genuine or whether the investigation methodology was sound, but questions about what was not in the episode, what happened in the location between the segments the broadcast version shows, what the investigation team encountered during the portions of the lockdown session that the edited version covers in a single line of narration, rather than in the detail the show typically applies to active investigation periods, and what Bagans himself was responding to in two specific moments in the episode, where his on-camera behavior communicates something that the surrounding footage does not explain. Those questions have been present in the Ghost Adventures community since the episode aired. Bagans just answered them. The location investigated in the controversial episode has a documented history that the broadcast version of the episode presented in edited form, covering its most dramatically significant historical elements while leaving others either unreferenced or referenced in passing, without the detail that their evidential significance warranted. Understanding why the location was always going to produce the kind of investigation that the broadcast version only partially represents requires engaging with the complete documented history rather than the edited version the episode provided. The location's anomalous history predates the Ghost Adventures investigation by decades and is documented across multiple independent sources, whose consistency across temporal and institutional distance gives the accumulated record a credibility that single-source accounts cannot claim. The prior investigators who had attempted systematic documentation of the location's phenomenon had produced findings whose specific characteristics the Ghost Adventures research team was fully aware of before the cameras arrived. findings that pointed toward a class of phenomenon at this location that was different in character from the haunting activity that the show's standard investigation format was designed to document and present. The distinction is important. Ghost Adventures has documented haunting activity across hundreds of locations across 20 seasons. The investigation team has developed a sophisticated operational framework for engaging with the category of phenomenon that haunted locations typically produce: the residual energy, the interactive intelligence, the physical manifestations of whatever remains at a location after the circumstances that created it have concluded. What the prior investigation record for this location indicated was present, there was not cleanly within that category. The specific characteristics of the prior documented activity, the physical effects on investigators, the nature of the responses produced during active investigation sessions, and the pattern of aftermath effects reported by people who had spent extended time on the property were consistent with a class of phenomenon that the Ghost Adventures team's operational experience had encountered in a small number of prior locations, and whose specific characteristics Bagans has always discussed with a particular quality of careful management that distinguishes his communications about this class from his communications about the broader range of haunting activity the show documents. The location was flagged internally before the investigation as belonging to that specific class. What that flagging meant for the investigation's operational protocols and what the investigation produced when those protocols were deployed in the location is the content of the exposure Bagans just delivered. The lockdown session at the controversial episode's location produced a sequence of events during a specific window of the investigation that the broadcast version of the episode covers in a manner that Bagans has now characterized as the most significant editorial decision in the franchise's 20-year broadcast history. Not the most dramatic editorial decision. The franchise's editorial history contains decisions about specific pieces of evidence whose dramatic significance exceeded anything in this episode. The most significant in the specific sense of a decision whose consequences for the integrity of the investigation's public record have been more extensive and more lasting than any comparable editorial choice the production has made. What happened during the relevant window of the lockdown session is what Bagans is exposing. His account of the specific events is the first complete public description of what the investigation encountered during that period. Not a reference to the existence of unreleased material, not a general acknowledgement that the broadcast version was incomplete, but a specific and detailed account of what occurred in the location during the window the broadcast version covers in summary. The events of that window involved a direct encounter between the investigation team and the phenomenon present at the location, an encounter whose specific characteristics placed it in the class of activity that the pre-investigation research had identified as the location's primary phenomenon. The encounter was not subtle. It was not ambiguous in the way that the evidence the broadcast version presents is ambiguous. It produced physical effects on members of the investigation team that were documented medically in the period following the lockdown session, and that the production's medical documentation records describe in terms that correspond directly to the class of phenomenon the pre-investigation research had identified. It produced instrument readings whose values the broadcast version references without showing the full data, readings that the investigation's technical records document as the most extreme values any Ghost Adventures investigation has ever generated across any instrument category. And it produced something else. Something that the cameras documented during the encounter's peak intensity that Bagans describes in his exposure with the specific quality of care that he applies to the most significant things he has ever said publicly about what Ghost Adventures has found in 20 years of investigation. The evidence removed from the controversial episode before broadcast falls into 3 specific categories whose combination is what made the network's decision to cut them collectively rather than to address them individually through the standard editorial process of contextualizing anomalous evidence within the show's established presentation framework. The first category is the instrument data from the lockdown session's peak intensity window. The readings generated during that window across the investigation's full instrument deployment represent values that the broadcast version of the episode references in general terms without showing the specific numbers. Those specific numbers, the electromagnetic field strength readings, the acoustic measurements in the relevant frequency ranges, and the thermal anomaly data from the cameras covering the encounter location are in the production's technical records and have been reviewed by people outside the immediate production team whose assessments of their significance have not been made public. What those assessments established about the instrument data is part of what Baggins is exposing. The second category is footage from the lockdown session itself, specific segments of the camera coverage that captured the encounter's development and whose visual content the network's editorial review determined could not be broadcast in the standard Ghost Adventures format without changes to that format that the network was not willing to make. The footage exists. Its existence has been acknowledged in the limited internal communications about the episode that have circulated among people connected to the production. What it shows is what Baggins' exposure addresses with the most specific language he has applied to any unreleased Ghost Adventures evidence in any public communication he has made about the franchise's suppressed material. The third category is Aaron Goodwin's account. Goodwin was present during the lockdown session's peak intensity window, and his on-camera account of what occurred during that window was recorded in full during the post-lockdown evidence review that the show's standard format includes at the end of each investigation. The broadcast version of the episode contains an edited version of that account whose specific edits remove the most significant elements of what Goodwin described experiencing. Baggins' exposure addresses what the unedited account contained, what Goodwin said in the complete post-lockdown review that the broadcast version did not include, and why the network's decision to edit it produced the most significant gap between the broadcast record and the complete investigation record that the franchise has ever created. Zak Bagans has discussed his personal experiences during Ghost Adventures investigations more candidly than any other paranormal television presenter has discussed comparable experiences across the genre's history. He has described physical effects, psychological impacts, and what he characterizes as attachments, the specific class of post-investigation consequence that his experience across 20 seasons of direct exposure to extreme paranormal phenomenon has given him a practiced framework for recognizing and addressing. His public record of discussing these personal experiences is extensive, and it has been consistent in its candor across the franchise's run. There is one investigation whose personal impact he has not discussed. Not in general terms, the audience that follows the franchise closely enough to track the pattern of Baggins' personal disclosures across his public communications has noted the absence of any substantive personal account of the controversial episode's investigation in the years since it broadcast. Not a reference to it being difficult, not an acknowledgement that it produced personal consequences consistent with his descriptions of other significant investigations' impacts. Silence. The specific silence that the Ghost Adventures audience has learned to recognize as the indicator that Baggins has drawn a boundary around something whose discussion he has determined requires a specific context that casual interview format does not provide. What he experienced during the lockdown session's peak intensity window is what the exposure now addresses directly for the first time. His account of what occurred during that window from his personal perspective, what he encountered, what he experienced physically and perceptually, and what the specific quality of the encounter produced in a man whose 20 years of direct exposure to extreme paranormal phenomenon had built a reference framework comprehensive enough to assess what most investigators would encounter without the context to understand, is the most significant element of the exposure. Not because it is more dramatic than the instrument data or the camera footage, because it comes from the person whose credibility in this specific domain, whose accumulated direct experience with the class of phenomenon documented in this investigation is the most defensible source of assessment available. Baggins knows what happened during that lockdown session at that location. He knows it with the specific confidence of someone who was there and who has spent 20 years developing the experiential vocabulary to understand what being there means. What he experienced is what he is now exposing, and the exposure is the first time he has been willing to provide the context he determined was necessary before he could discuss it honestly. Travel Channel's role in the production of the controversial episode and in the decisions that shaped what the audience received as its broadcast version is the dimension of the exposure that Baggins addresses with the most evident weight, because the network's editorial involvement in the episode was not the standard content management relationship that governs every Ghost Adventures broadcast broadcast. It was something more specific and more consequential. The standard Ghost Adventures editorial relationship between Baggins Production and Travel Channel operates within a framework whose parameters both parties understand and whose application to specific pieces of evidence has produced friction across multiple prior seasons without ever producing the kind of fundamental disagreement about the nature of the editorial process itself that the controversial episode generated. Travel Channel reviews the production's assembled episodes, applies its content standards and editorial judgment to specific segments, and communicates its decisions to the production in terms that reflect the standard commercial television relationship between a network and its programming supplier. That process has produced cuts and modifications across the franchise's run, evidence that was ambiguous enough to be softened without misrepresenting the investigation, segments that exceeded the network's content parameters for its audience, and moments whose legal or reputational implications the network's legal team identified as requiring management. The editorial process applied to the controversial episode was not that standard process. What Baggins describes about the network's engagement with the episode's footage is an involvement that went beyond the standard review framework in its speed, in the level of the organizational hierarchy at which decisions were made, and in the specific nature of the instructions that came back to the production about what the episode was permitted to contain. The instructions were not editorial recommendations, they were restrictions, specific, non-negotiable, and delivered with a finality whose character Baggins characterizes in The Exposure as unlike anything in his 20 years of experience navigating the production's relationship with the network. What produced that character, what made the network's response to the controversial episode's footage so different from its response to every comparable piece of Ghost Adventures evidence across the franchise's run, is the question that The Exposure answers by describing what the footage contained. The network's response was proportional to what they saw, and what they saw in the controversial episode's uncut footage was something that produced in the people whose professional responsibility it was to make editorial decisions about Ghost Adventures content the same response that it produced in everyone who has reviewed the complete footage record. The response of people who understood immediately that what they were looking at could not be managed within any framework they possessed. The Ghost Adventures audience that has followed the franchise across 20 seasons has been building a relationship with the investigation's documented evidence record that The Exposure now fundamentally recontextualizes. Not because The Exposure contradicts what the broadcast record contains, nothing Baggins reveals about the controversial episode suggests that what the audience was shown was fabricated or misrepresented in the basic sense of presenting something as real that was not. What The Exposure establishes is that the broadcast record of the most controversial Ghost Adventures episode was incomplete in a specific and significant way, that the investigation produced evidence whose existence and whose character the audience was not informed of, and that the editorial decisions that produced that incompleteness were made for reasons that went beyond the ordinary content management considerations the franchise's editorial history had previously generated. For the audience members whose engagement with Ghost Adventures has been oriented toward the evidence, who have followed the franchise because of what its investigations have documented rather than because of the entertainment format that packages that documentation, The Exposure produces a specific and consequential reassessment. Every broadcast episode now needs to be understood as the portion of the investigation's complete record that the network determined could be shown, not as the complete record itself. That reassessment has been available as a hypothesis across the franchise's run, based on the pattern of content management decisions that the prior season's production history has made visible. The Exposure converts the hypothesis into a confirmed fact. The broadcast Ghost Adventures record is a managed fraction of the complete Ghost Adventures record. The controversial episode is the most documented evidence of that fraction, the case where the management was most extensive, most consequential, and whose extent Baggins has now chosen to expose rather than continue to accept. What The Exposure means for the Ghost Adventures community's relationship to the investigation's prior broadcast record is a question each viewer will have to answer individually. What it means for the franchise's future, for the relationship between Baggins and Travel Channel, for the production's approach to the evidence management decisions the network applies to its investigation footage, and for what the audience can expect from the investigation going forward, is the question that The Exposure opens without fully closing. Baggins made a decision to expose this truth. That decision has consequences for every prior decision the production has made about what the audience was shown, and working through those consequences is what the Ghost Adventures community is now going to be doing. The truth Zak Baggins just exposed changes three things simultaneously: the episode's standing in the broadcast record, What the audience understood as controversial for the reasons the broadcast version generated is now revealed as controversial for reasons that the broadcast version was never permitted to establish. The complete record of what the investigation produced at that location is more significant than anything the franchise has ever broadcast. The broadcast record's relationship to the complete investigation record, the exposure confirms what the most attentive Ghost Adventures viewers have been sensing across multiple seasons without having it verified. The broadcast version is a managed fraction. This episode is the clearest proof of how significant that fraction is. And Bagans' own position, he operated within the editorial framework that produced the incomplete version for years. The exposure ends that. He decided the audience deserved the truth and delivered it. 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures have been building toward this moment. The most controversial episode was controversial for the wrong reasons. Now the right ones are public. And what they reveal about what that investigation actually found is what the franchise has always been pointing toward.